Hey you, leave her right now. When Ted and I went into the examination room at the obstetrics and gynecology clinic, the doctor who looked at our faces alternately said something outrageous. Excuse me? Filled with shock and disgust at the doctor who blurted out such an inappropriate comment about someone's privacy, I was stunned. For some reason, Ted didn't question it or say anything. I was so bewildered that I couldn't move from where I was standing. Leave who? Maybe this doctor had been dozing off. Maybe he had a weird dream and was just sleep-talking, saying something that made no sense at all. But then again, his eyes were looking straight at Ted and me. No, you misunderstood. It's him, your husband, said the doctor, his voice quietly burning with anger. Ted's name came from his mouth, and he stared back at the doctor with a serious look on his face. My name is Nancy Johnson. I'm currently 30 and work as a nurse. I married Ted 5 years ago when I was 25, but given my nursing career, our lifestyles haven't quite matched up. Therefore, our marital life was unsatisfactory, and before we knew it, 5 years had passed without us having a child. Ted, for some reason, always said, "Don't worry, it'll happen eventually," as though he didn't really want children. Sure, at my age, it may be too early to worry, but I had been thinking since I was a child that I wanted 3 children when I got married, so it was true that I was becoming anxious about not having the first one soon. Ted is just an ordinary office worker. I shouldn't say it too loudly, but his salary isn't high. Even though he's been working since he was fresh out of college, raises are few, and without a promotion, there's no expectation of a significant salary increase. It might be a financial concern. Maybe Ted doesn't want children yet. Plus, lately, it seems to be a busy period at work, and he often works late. He comes home late at night quite often. I wondered if he'd ever been this busy before. And when I asked Ted, he said that a new project had started, and the busy periods had increased. Our lifestyles were increasingly mismatched, and I was starting to feel lonely. Ted was usually a gentle and kind husband. Apart from our different opinions about children, there was hardly anything I was dissatisfied with, so I never dreamed that something like that would happen. It was a year ago when I suggested to Ted that I wanted to start trying to conceive. Our marital life was stagnant back then, and I was feeling impatient. Many of my friends who were already married had children. Every time I saw updates about their children on social media, I'd think, "That's nice." And slowly that turned into envy. I was envious to the point where I became jealous, so I stopped checking social media as much. Because of that, I chose the timing just a year ago when Ted returned from work and told him I wanted to start trying to have a baby. Trying to conceive. Isn't it something that can happen naturally? We don't need to make a big deal out of it, do we? But that's not always the case. If the timing isn't right, it doesn't mean anything. That's what my friends were saying. Those are just your friends' opinions, right? People's timing for having children can be different, so don't take it too seriously. But still, at that time I didn't know much about trying to conceive, so I couldn't argue with Ted's reluctance. Even if the awareness of trying to conceive differs between men and women, he could have shown a little more cooperative attitude, couldn't he? Anyway, if you get too caught up in it, you might not be able to conceive even if you could. Let's just be patient. Yeah, I guess so. Certainly, as Ted says, when you get impatient, it feels like it's less likely to happen. And I had felt the same way. Feeling frustrated, I went to work that night since I had the night shift. During my break at work, I talked to a colleague about it, and she scolded me saying, "You can't be so nonchalant about this." I was the one who wanted to be angry at Ted, so I was slightly annoyed by my colleague's words. "So what should I do?" I asked, and she advised, "Why don't you go to an OB/GYN? Why go to an OB/GYN when there's nothing wrong with me?" I hesitated, but she informed me, nowadays, many women go to the OB/GYN right away when they want to have a baby. This was a new idea to me, and it was quite an eye-opener. My next day off is in 2 days. It's a weekday, so I thought I'd try going to the OB/GYN. So in 2 days, I decided to go to the nearest OB/GYN to my house. Of course, I kept it a secret from Ted. Although it was the closest, the OB/GYN was 2 train stations away, perhaps because they were few in number. It was a weekday morning, so I assumed it wouldn't be too crowded. But when I got to the OB/GYN, I was taken aback by the number of people. All the waiting room chairs were filled, and there were even pregnant women standing and waiting. Given the situation, I of course couldn't take a seat and leaned against the wall waiting my turn. I was finally called into the examination room, and I received the examination about an hour after arriving at the hospital. That day, the doctor told me to first try the timing method, coordinating our intimacy to coincide with my ovulation period, which seemed to be the first approach taken in trying to conceive. If this goes well, I could be expecting within a few months. I ruminated on what the doctor taught me, thinking about our future life. First, I had to tell Ted about the timing method. Since it was something that required cooperation between us as a couple, I determinedly talked to Ted that night. "I'm sorry to bother you when you're tired from work, but I went to the OB GYN today," I said, and Ted turned his red alcohol-flushed face to me, his eyes wide with surprise. "I really want a child." The doctor suggested something called the timing method. I explained the timing method to Ted. A tipsy Ted didn't seem to be taking my words very seriously, but at least he didn't interrupt me. "And will you cooperate with me?" I tried to choose my words carefully not to offend Ted, but he scratched his head, looking bothered, and responded. It feels like being forced, and I'm not into it at all. Isn't there another way?" Ted's insensitive words made my head spin. It took a lot of courage just to go to the OB/GYN, and it was embarrassing to share our marital problems with a male doctor, even though he was a professional. Without knowing all the trouble I've been going through, and without distinguishing between what's appropriate and what's not, I felt like giving Ted a piece of my mind. But I knew that if we fought now, he would become even more uncooperative, so I held back. Other methods can cost quite a bit of money. So, they said to start with the method that doesn't cost anything. "Please, will you cooperate with me?" Even Ted seemed troubled by the mention of the expense, and though reluctantly, he agreed to try the method the doctor had suggested. Convincing Ted was an exhausting task in itself, and I was apprehensive about what lay ahead. A year had almost passed since we started trying to have a baby. Not only was Ted completely unmotivated from the beginning, but our lifestyles didn't match, and things didn't go well. In addition, whether he was disgusted by being forced into marital life, Ted often didn't come home on the scheduled day. With only one chance a month, I felt like crying, but I couldn't lash out at Ted because it would only make him lose interest. Stress caused my period to be late, and I even had to get medication from the doctor. "When will I have a child?" I couldn't help feeling weak and complained in front of the doctor. "I can't say for sure, but if you follow my instructions, the odds will be much higher." The doctor listened seriously to my concerns and even gave advice on how to get Ted to cooperate. I was grateful, but also irritated by why Ted wouldn't cooperate with me. That night, it was the once-a-month chance, so I had resolved to invite Ted. But Ted didn't come home even as the date changed. I had a day shift the next day, so I didn't want to stay up too late. Just as I sighed and was about to give up and go to sleep, I finally heard the front door open. It was about to be 1 a.m. And home. He entered the living room laughing sloppily, possibly drunk, slurring his words. I was so dizzy at Ted's overly carefree attitude. "Do you remember what today is?" I didn't want to say this, but I realized that I had to say it clearly or Ted wouldn't understand. I determinedly confronted Ted. Today? What day was it?" Perhaps he finally remembered when he saw my serious face, and he lazily narrowed his eyes. "If you didn't like it, you should have called. I was waiting all this time." I couldn't help but remember all the troubles so far and vented my dissatisfaction to Ted. I've been thinking." Ted's eyes narrowed snake-like. "I'm under so much pressure. I'm told every month to keep the schedule free. Put yourself in my shoes, coming home tired from work. Frankly, I don't want to be with you right now." I gasped at Ted's words. Indeed, I had been rushing Ted to keep the schedule free every month. If the positions were reversed, I would have been stressed too. But I had been making requests to Ted as gently as possible, so as not to put too much burden on him. I was holding back what I really wanted to say, which was to take this more seriously. Still, seeing Ted, who assumed he was the only one struggling, I felt miserable. "Well, let's take a break for a while." I felt that if we continued this way, it would only increase the burden on both of us. I called for a temporary truce. Ted seemed relieved at my proposal, saying, "That's fine then." I felt faint at the thought of when we might be able to have a child. 3 months after I told Ted about the truce, he seemed to be released from the pressure of trying to conceive, and he began going out to play on his days off. He would leave in the morning and not return until night, and I wondered what he was doing. Ted doesn't have any particular hobbies, so I assumed he was out with friends. That was how Ted had been, but whether this truce had worked or not, he began to take part in our marital life on his own. And just 3 months after we resumed our marital life, my pregnancy was discovered. I was overwhelmed with emotion when I saw the positive reaction of the pregnancy test. I reported to Ted right away. "Oh, that's great." Ted's reaction was unexpectedly disappointing. "What's wrong? Aren't you happy?" Even though Ted usually doesn't say he wants children, I thought he would be happy to have his own child, but he looked somewhat troubled. "Of course I'm happy, but we really don't know if you're pregnant until we see the doctor, right?" "Yes, maybe we should go to the hospital next week. Then I'll drive you there. Let's go to the hospital together." For the first time in a while, I saw Ted's gentle side and was relieved. Perhaps Ted was happy too. He might be holding back his joy until the pregnancy was confirmed at the hospital. With that in mind, Ted's reaction seemed reasonable. And a week later, as planned, Ted drove me to the hospital. It was the obstetrics and gynecology clinic I regularly visit. We checked in and waited in the waiting room for our turn. "Mrs. Johnson, please." Today was busier than usual, so I waited for over an hour before the receptionist called my name. I finished having my blood pressure taken and a urine test, and then entered the examination room with Ted. Inside the examination room, the doctor was looking at my medical chart. The nurse urged Ted and me to sit down and then, possibly busy, retreated to the back of the room. Left in the examination room were Ted, the doctor, and me. When the doctor looked up at Ted and me, he somehow opened his eyes wide. Wondering if there was something strange on our faces, we looked at each other but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "You're Mrs. Johnson, correct?" "Yes. I always have my appointments here." "That's right. Is something wrong? I'm not pregnant, am I?" "You are pregnant. Congratulations. But there's something else." The doctor looked at me with a meaningful expression, then his gaze fixed on Ted. And after staring intently at Ted's face for several seconds, he let out a breath and opened his mouth. "Hey you, leave her right now." "What?" I was filled with surprise and disgust at the doctor's rude intrusion into our privacy. Ted, for some reason, did not respond. I was so confused that I could not move from the spot. "Leave her? Go with?" Could it be that the doctor had been dozing off until now? Maybe he had a weird dream and was still half asleep, blurting out something unrelated, but his eyes were fixed intently on Ted and me. "No, you misunderstand. It's your husband." The doctor's name for Ted came out of his quietly angry mouth, and Ted stared back at him, expressionless. "I know this isn't something I should say as a doctor. I'm sorry, but I felt I had to tell you, Mrs. Johnson. This doctor knew about my struggles, including my desperate desire to have a child. That's why he said something so rude. There must be an extraordinary reason." Seeing the doctor's sincere look, I decided to listen to what he had to say. "What exactly are you talking about?" Anyway, I had to hear his side of the story. I was ready to hear what the doctor had to say, my ear attuned to him. "It's a very private matter, but I found out recently that my wife was cheating on me. I was in shock and disoriented for a while. But because of my profession, I couldn't easily take time off, so I continued working, pretending to be calm. My wife denied the affair, but I was not convinced, so I hired a private investigator to look for evidence. I couldn't predict how the doctor's sudden story about his wife's infidelity related to us, and I stood still, unable to move from my spot. Ted, as usual, was expressionless, listening to the doctor's words. I couldn't understand what Ted was thinking right now. The results were devastating. Within a week, evidence of my wife's infidelity came flooding in. Pictures of her arm in arm with her lover entering a hotel, exchanges of messages with the lover, phone call histories. They just kept coming. By that time, I'd had enough. and didn't want to hear any more from the investigator. But curiosity got the better of me, and I looked at a picture of the lover's face. And then, the doctor looked at Ted again. His eyes turned hateful. I instinctively covered my mouth, and at the same time, cradled my belly. I had a premonition that once I heard what came next, there would be no going back. My wife's lover was Ted Johnson, your husband. The doctor's words fell sharply into my gut, leaving me in despair. When the two of you walked into the examination room, I felt as if I had been struck dumb. The face I had seen in photographs as my wife's lover was right before my eyes. And to think that it was Mrs. Johnson's husband, I never would have believed my wife was cheating on me. Is that true, honey? I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't help myself, nor could the doctor. Both our fates were in Ted's hands, and I felt sick to my stomach. Ted was silent for a while, perhaps looking for some room to defend himself, but realizing that the doctor and I were staring at him intently, he finally burst out laughing. It's true, I'll just say it now. I don't love Nancy anymore. I'm tired of trying for a baby. If she really wanted a child, she should have taken a more certain approach. But she didn't even do that. Coming home from work only to be pressured when I'm tired, and that's when I met her. She was always complaining about her husband being away from home for work. But I never thought her husband would be Nancy's doctor. Ted, unabashed, admitted to having an affair with the doctor's wife. I almost fainted on the spot, but held myself together, meeting the doctor's eyes. I'm sure the doctor and I are feeling the same way right now. How can he betray someone so calmly? Moreover, Ted is not only trying to ruin me, but the doctor's family as well. I was filled with an unforgiving feeling towards Ted. Ted, I may have been wrong to make you feel like I was forcing you into trying for a baby, and for that, I'm sorry. But that's separate from the affair, isn't it? The root cause of all this is the stress I got from Nancy. I'm the victim here. I almost want to be paid for my suffering. You're gonna pay, right? You, the doctor, should also pay, since your wife ran to the affair because of stress. At this moment, Ted, insisting on his right to compensation without admitting his guilt, began to unravel. Being pressured to have a baby was nothing compared to the fact that he cheated for that reason, which is absolutely unacceptable. He might genuinely think he's in the right, he's the victim, but the doctor and I were listening to Ted with cold hearts. Do you even know what you're saying? I couldn't hold back any longer. Until now, I had been considerate of Ted, who had been kind in all aspects except for trying for a baby. But after being told all this, I couldn't stay silent. I had reached my breaking point. Of course, you'll be the one to pay, Ted. I can't believe you cheated. Knowing that we had a child on the way, I have a responsibility to raise this child now. And I'll have you take responsibility as well. Not just splitting assets, but also making sure you pay child support. Huh? You can say that, but I don't have any money. Then borrow, or do whatever you have to do. I'm willing to consult with a lawyer. You won't stand a chance then. If it's compensation for emotional damage, I'll claim it from my wife too. The two of you can pay us back together. You two will end up getting married anyways. Both the doctor and I, planning to break up with our cheating partners, confronted Ted together. Finally, Ted gave in to my logical argument and left the examination room. I'm truly sorry for my husband's actions. No, my wife is the one to blame, especially since you just found out about a new life being born. No, this child doesn't need that father. Rather, I'm glad I found out before it was born. Thank you. Though the betrayal and frustration were undeniable, I felt like this doctor had helped me in my private matters as well. It will be tough from here on, but please feel free to consult with me anytime. I'll help as much as I can. The doctor's kind consideration made me tear up. The pain was the same for both of us, the doctor and me. As comrades, we looked at each other for a while, comforting each other's wounds. Many things happened that day. My pregnancy was confirmed without any problems, and I was told to come for a checkup again in a few weeks. Before I left, there were many patients waiting, and though I felt sorry for them, I couldn't leave without addressing my own situation. I couldn't afford to think of others right now. Ted had gone home already, so I had no choice but to take the train home. Feeling lonely, but also thinking about the new life inside me, I felt encouraged. We'll get through this together. As I stroked my belly, the still very small life inside seemed to be watching over me, and I felt happy. When I got home, Ted was gone, and a divorce lawyer's business card was left on the dining table. I had already decided to divorce Ted, so without resistance I called the number written on it. Ted thinks he can get alimony from me, but as I told him earlier, I'm the one who's gonna get the alimony. I'll make sure to demand child support as well. I promptly began preparing to consult a lawyer. I, of course, won overwhelmingly in the divorce negotiations with Ted. It's Ted's fault in the first place. It was a mistake for him to try to take alimony from me. When I presented the various evidence of infidelity that I received from the OB GYN, Ted could only stammer without any excuses. I demanded a $100,000 lump sum for child support, in addition to the property settlement. Why all at once? He complained, but knowing Ted, he might stop transferring the money halfway through if I asked for a monthly amount. That's why I decided to demand it all at once, to make him feel the weight of his guilt. It seems the doctor also divorced his wife and demanded alimony. We regularly communicated and reported each other's situation. The doctor's wife, possibly just now noticing the difference between Ted's salary and the doctor's, and given that Ted was made to pay child support in a lump sum, seems to be having financial troubles with Ted. She reportedly appealed to the doctor saying, "I want to come back to you." But the doctor firmly refused to return to the previous relationship. Once betrayed, a relationship can never be mended. He answered disgusted, "I agree with his opinion. It's too selfish to expect to return to the old relationship after causing so much trouble. I hope Ted and the woman suffer for a while for breaking up other families. We're like comrades, aren't we? Yes, if you don't mind, would you like to go for tea sometime? Anytime you're free." I surprisingly didn't feel uncomfortable at the doctor's invitation. It must be because he's treating me in a gentlemanly manner. I must stop fantasizing that maybe someday something could happen with this doctor, and now just hope that my unborn child grows healthy and is born safely.